much. Wow, what a great turnout. My name's Jane Golley. I'm the head of the Arndt-Corden Department of Economics here at the Crawford School. It's such a wonderful privilege to come here and introduce our keynote speaker today for the 2025 Mitchell Oration. What a vibrant gathering. I think probably the busiest and most vibrant event of the year in the Crawford calendar. So thank you all for coming. And what a great opportunity to share ideas with each other, just as the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people have done on these lands for tens of thousands of years. And I think we're all very privileged to stand on their land, never ceded. So I pay my respects to all of those past, present and emerging. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Eric Olander. He's been here for the last couple of days, so I'm sure lots of you have had a chance to converse with him. I've been consuming his various podcasts and videos over the last, year or so actually, even including in the last week or more, and really fantastic speaker. He's got a velvet-like voice, so I hope you'll stay awake for it, because it's a pleasure just to listen to the words coming out, but they're also, I think, really insightful, come from his very deep knowledge and also grounded knowledge, especially of China, with a long and distinguished career as a journalist, working for CNN and the BBC, many others, lots of time spent in China, but also as the co-founder and chief editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project. You understand the Global South from within. I understand you're currently living in Ho Chi Minh City, and is just so well placed to be speaking about this. I think, as you'll gather very quickly when Eric starts to speak, he doesn't mince his words, he tells it how he sees it, and I think that's fairly evident in the title, where he is declaring today and speaking about a post-American international order. Eric's going to speak for about 30 minutes, then we'll open it up to Q&A, so please join me in welcoming Eric to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to be very disciplined on time today, because I do want to let time for questions, because I know this is a topic that many of you are interested in. I want to thank also Cameron and Stephen for the very kind invitation to come today to talk about what is a really very sensitive project. If we could, let me go back. There we go. I always start my presentations with this slide here. China is a very provocative and sensitive topic. Too much of the discourse, particularly here in Australia and certainly in the United States, is either you hate China or you love China. I don't look at China as good or bad. I look at China as complicated. And I'm not here to persuade you of anything. You take away with it what you see. I'm just going to lay out an argument, and you can decide if you think that it is persuasive or not. But this is not about trying to compel you to believe that China is good or China is bad. I'm going to take a much stronger point of view than I think what you've heard here over the past couple of days. The world doesn't exist as we know it anymore. It's over. What you have learned up until now is over. These are structural changes. USAID is not coming back in any meaningful form. The American taxpayer doesn't want it. The American taxpayer doesn't believe in it. In Europe, we're seeing a downgrade of aid. I think I heard the other day that 2,000 FCDO folks are going to be losing their jobs pretty soon. There's a shift in Europe now towards buying a lot more guns. There's a shift here in Asia to buy a lot more guns. You cannot have guns and butter at the same time. Governments are going to shift their defense spending up massively. So these shifts into aid are, in my view, structural, and they will be for the foreseeable future. There's a lot of people who say, well, when Donald Trump is out of power and Gavin Newsom comes back into power, everything's going to be fine. That's not true, because the American Congress will still be as divided as it always is. This is actually not just an American thing. We've been hearing from our diplomatic friends who came the other day that the cuts are across the board in the aid system. So the Western aid system is, I don't want to say collapsing, but it is restructuring to a point that we won't recognize it as it was. We have to start the thinking over again. This is 0 day right now. And at the same time, there is a big change not only happening on the bilateral side, but it's happening at the institutional side as well. And we're going to talk about this, but the United States has effectively quit the United Nations. That is significant because the United States has been the largest provider of funds to the United Nations. It was the backbone of the ideology to the United Nations. What happens when the UN doesn't have the US? Then we're going to see the major European powers effectively pull back in their spending, and also countries like Canada as well. So this has raised the question, is China going to fill the void? And we've seen so many articles that have popped up now that the Chinese are rushing in to take over from USAID. I've seen that here in Australia, and I certainly have seen it in Europe and the US. And it is a concern that a lot of people in the West have, that they are going to be displaced. This taps into this fear that China wants to become the global hegemonic power to replace the United States. Now, that's a misreading of what China wants to do. There is no evidence whatsoever in the literature. The Chinese themselves will say it. They do not want to provide global public goods. They don't want to patrol the South Atlantic. They don't want to ensure the global security for oil around the world. That is not what they want to do, and they certainly do not want to replace the United States or the West in the foreign aid system. It's just not going to happen. That concern is absolutely misplaced. Here's 4 reasons why China is not going to replace the US, the West, in the aid system. Aid is not a cultural imperative in China. It's not in the ethos. A lot of our aid system today is built on a Judeo-Christian mindset and ideology of help the poor, to save people around the world. The Chinese just don't have that tradition. That's not to say that the Chinese are not charitable people. It's to say that the way that they express charity through policy does not really exist within the Chinese political system. It's just not something that they've done historically. It's not something that they really believe in. And it's at the end of the day, it's also not something that really has any traction within the Chinese political hierarchy. They also lack the infrastructure, even if they wanted to replace the United States, for example. One of the most amazing things about USAID was just this massive infrastructure of moving grain from Nebraska to silos, to warehouses, then shipping all around the world and then distributing it, having partner agencies here in Australia and around the world. It was an amazing infrastructure that they had. China doesn't have anywhere near that. It doesn't have anything at all, in fact. So again, even if it wanted to replace the United States as a global aid provider, it simply couldn't, because it doesn't have the means to do it in terms of infrastructure. Infrastructure, both in terms of human infrastructure, the consultants, the agencies, the people on the ground who make it happen, the relationships. They don't have the network of partners that USAID had. One of the things that shocked me a little bit when USAID went out of business was just how far USAID money was spread around the world. The Chinese aren't going to do that. Again, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to build that infrastructure. They also don't have the physical infrastructure that aid requires, so they're not going to do that. China today is not the China of 10 years ago. China's economy today is mired in massive amounts of debt, domestic debt, massive amounts of property deflation. They have a huge property crisis. The Chinese economy is encountering a maturation and a slowdown and a transformation. Youth unemployment in many parts is 20, 30, 40%. They don't have the cash to pump $11 billion of aid into Africa every year, even if they wanted to. Again, even if they wanted to do what the Western narratives were saying that they wanted to do, they simply can't. They don't have the money to do it today. China is borrowing money heavily. China is indebted heavily. So the idea of spending tens of billions of dollars on foreign aid, just not possible. Again, even if they wanted to. Finally, and this is something that's underappreciated, foreign aid in China is just as unpopular as foreign aid is in the United States, in Europe, and probably here even in Australia. Okay? You ask the average Chinese person on the street, should we be sending money to Africa or to Southeast Asia to help them in their education, just give money away for free? I guarantee you the responses would be exactly the same. People would say, why are we giving money to them when my school, my road, when we still have 100 million people who are poor in China? Why? That doesn't make any sense. Here's what's interesting. In 2018, at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that was happening in Beijing, they announced then it was a $60 billion aid package, and I was sitting online in China at the time when this happened, and it was absolutely fascinating. As soon as that news came out on WeChat, people started flooding WeChat furious. Why are we giving money to the Africans like this? This is crazy. Now, what they didn't know was that a big chunk of that $60 billion is in the form of loans, which is profit-making, but they didn't say that. But within 2 or 3 hours of the news of the $60 billion package in 2018 going on WeChat, the censors kicked in and started wiping it clean. There was no more discussion of this. Since 2018, in 2024, the same thing happened. No discussion. It's all been wiped. And then at the BRI Forum, when they announced $50 billion, same thing. It all got wiped. The conversation about aid in China is censored now for that reason. So it gives you an indication that this is not a popular topic at home. There's not a lot of political will to spend billions of dollars on foreign aid. So again, even if China wanted to do this thing that the Western media and the West is concerned about, they couldn't do it even if they wanted to. But what are the Chinese doing? They're not standing still. And this is really important. So right after USAID went down, all of a sudden, and you see all these concerns start to pop up now about are the Chinese filling the void, we start seeing these headlines of the Chinese announcing some very targeted strategic deployments of capital in very, very particular places. So the first one was the demining in Cambodia. When USAID pulled out of this, and again, I live in Vietnam, so this is a topic. They also, by the way, cut their Agent Orange rehabilitation in Vietnam, which is similarly kind of painful as the demining is in Cambodia. But when they came in when the US pulled out of Cambodia, there was abject fear in Cambodia. For anybody who knows this region, landmines continue to be a scourge of daily life for farmers and for everyday people. And these are mines that were left going back to the 70s and 80s, but unfortunately now with the Thai-Cambodia conflict, we have more mines coming back in again. So demining is a very, very frontline issue. The Chinese came in with a $4 million donation, $4.4 million donation. The symbolism of this was very important because they were backfilling a USAID initiative, so this got a lot. But again, the amount, very, very small, a fraction of what the US was spending in this campaign. Same thing here in the Africa CDC, $4 million, very targeted because it backfilled the US withdrawal. Now, notice that this one was done with the South Koreans. So we don't actually know, was this 3 million by the South Koreans, 1 million by the Chinese? Did the Chinese provide goods? We don't know much about it. That's another hallmark of what the Chinese do, is they capture the headline, but the substance of what they're doing is oftentimes very opaque. But what this shows us is they're going to come in with very targeted, usually low dollar amount, that are high profile, that also have a political objective to it as well. These were very skillfully chosen in order to capture attention at the moment that they did it. And so again, this is all about the geopolitics of it. And then came the Mandalay earthquake. This was a milestone in many ways. Myanmar, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is this tragic case of a country that's been wrapped up in civil war, insurgency, now beset by scam centers, drug running. The Myanmar-Chinese border is a lawless zone. And then this near 8.0 earthquake comes and just rips through a country that was already on its knees. Now, what was fascinating about this is that this earthquake came in March, just as USAID was being doged, just as everything was being cut down. Now, normally on an earthquake like this, one of the largest responses would be the United States government. In fact, every major international disaster of the past 10, 20, 30 years, the US has always had a response. What I want to show you here is the Chinese response. And it was very interesting because a lot of things happened for the first time on a scale that we had not seen before. Let me see if I can you play that video? So I'm going to show you, so this is some of the video that started to come through. What you're going to see in the video, a couple things. The imagery and the iconography of it all is very important, and how they project this. First of all, you're seeing kind of this orderly, large-scale deployment of resources within 24 hours of the earthquake happening. The most important thing I want you to look at are those Y-20 cargo planes. Those are like the C-130s that the US had. This is a relatively new capacity for the Chinese to be able to deploy large amounts of resources. What they're showing here in this media, and you're going to see the media imagery of what they did in Myanmar, is absolutely essential to project this power. China has arrived as a major power that can respond quickly in a way that the US once was the only one who could do this. Again, these Y-20s, and we started to see the Y-20s now also in Pakistan a couple of months ago too. So this deployment of resources, of technology, of military capacity is again something that we haven't seen. Now, one of the things about earthquake response, in this particular case about Myanmar, China itself is beset by earthquakes as comparable as what we see in Myanmar. So they have skills, resources, material, technology, dogs ready to go. Interesting, the deployment that came for this response also came from across the country. One of the trends that we see across the board in Chinese engagement in the global south is that the central government, for the most part, is starting to pull back more. What we saw in Myanmar was Chongqing, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, all sending people and material into Myanmar. We can go on to the next one. And so this was a milestone in many respects because they used this as an opportunity to project power and to tell their new story as the emergent power, or increasingly the hegemonic power in Asia. In particular, one of the things we saw was the deployment of Chinese technology. This was a major part of their narrative. Chinese drones, heat-seeking drones looking under the rubble for people. This was a display, a capacity that no one else has really had up until now. Again, this idea of of large quantities of aid coming in very, very quickly was also part of their messaging. Here's the Chongqing, the Blue Sky Rescue Teams. The diversity of Chinese actors that were on the scene was also something that was notable as well. And again, these Y-20s is a new capacity that the Chinese, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, really didn't have or didn't deploy for humanitarian reasons. This was something that only really the US and Europe, for the most part, had and used. Of course, other countries have C-130s, but they have so few of them, they don't use them for humanitarian response. So, in many ways, Myanmar was a turning point. We did not have any US response. There were 7 USAID workers who were sent to Myanmar, and my understanding is that they got fired when they were on the ground in Myanmar. Okay. This was an Asian response to an Asian crisis. Now, I'm talking about the Chinese here, but when I was in Vietnam talking about this, they stopped me and they said, wait. Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand all responded very, very quickly. It was a very impressive turnout, and it started to give us this glimpse of what the post-American order is starting to look like, a world where the United States is not even relevant, not participatory. There was very little European response. Normally the EU would be there in pretty large numbers for something like this. They didn't show up either. There was a massive Chinese response. It was an impressive response. It was military, civilian, technology, dogs, resources, everything I was showing. And this starts to backfill the narrative that the Chinese have been talking about for decades, about Asia for Asians. Asia for Asians means pushing the US back past the second island chain. They want the US out of continental Asian affairs. This is what it starts to look like. We started to hear this in some of the narrative coming out of the foreign ministry in response to the Myanmar, that we took care of our own affairs. We didn't need them. That was a very important milestone. Okay, so behind these humanitarian responses, which we're starting to see more frequently, again, Pakistan just showed up on the radar where the Y-20 showed up, aid is coming up. Throughout Southeast Asia, this past 3 or 4 weeks, we saw Chinese response to flooding. $1 million was donated to Sri Lanka just this week. there's an architecture that's starting to take shape that the Chinese are putting forward. So you want to understand the foreign aid situation, you have to understand this architecture. First, the US is withdrawing from the world. They just don't believe that these institutions are worthy. We just have to listen to what Marco Rubio said in his confirmation hearing, where he said, we don't believe that the liberal international order suits the United States anymore. Take him at his word. That is what they feel. I was speaking to DFAT, and I've spoken to FCDO and some others. I don't think that has fully sunken into them yet. They're still holding on to an idea that there's hope that the United States is somehow going to come back online again. They're not. Once you break these things, it's very hard to go back. We're not going to get an education department in the United States again. USAID is not coming back. What is broke will not be repaired, and the UN is included in that. The US is $1 billion behind. That's not unusual. We're generally late with our funding because of the congressional funding cycles, but now increasingly the MAGA wing of the party doesn't want to pay. In fact, there was an article today that a congressman from Texas wants to kick the UN out of New York. That just speaks to the hostility that they have towards the UN. Total arrears, $3 billion. I spoke with a friend of mine at the UN, and he says they've effectively quit. They're not showing up for meetings. They're basically coming to the Security Council, and for the most part, for the past 6 months, it's been coming to the Security Council, defend Israel, bash Russia, and get out. There's not much more that they're doing there. So again, what does a world look like when the US isn't participating in these institutions? There's already active discussions going on in Washington today about what happens to the World Bank if the United States withdraws. According to the charter of the World Bank, it moves to its largest shareholder. We could see the World Bank relocate to Tokyo. Donald Trump has spoken openly about this. Can you play the video? Just listen to his words. This is him at his UNGA. If you can. Okay, no way. Basically, he says the UN has a lot of potential, but it's not living up to its potential, and he doesn't really see the value in the US continuing to participate in it. We can go to the next slide. And this is going to continue. They're going to keep downgrading their engagement. What does that mean? Again, I don't know, but we're in a new world where we don't know how these things are going to unfold. I just want to encourage you not to hold on to the old world, because again, I don't think it's coming back. So, here's China now. China loves the UN in many ways. Largest peacekeeping operation contributor among the P5, second largest financial supporter. 4 out of 15 of the UN agencies are run by Chinese nationals. And more importantly, we're going to talk about the UN and the UN doctrines, some of them, not all of them, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, not the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, serve as the foundation of China's new governance model that it's pushing forward. But it's really important, and this is a fear that we have in the West, that China wants to replace the US and replace the West as this hegemonic power. Again, everything we hear and see says that is not the case. And I like this quote because, again, it's to make more room for China to move and to maneuver, but not necessarily to displace the existing international order. So again, that's a hard concept, I think, for a lot of people who think in very binary terms. It's us or it's them. It's the Soviets or it's the Americans. It's the Chinese or it's the Americans. We can't think like that. And that's not what the Chinese want. So what we're starting to see now is the retreat of a US and this emergence of a new Sinocentric order. So Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. 2013, he announces the Belt and Road, and along with it, he brings a whole architecture of thought under the Community for Common Destiny, which is under this idea of national rejuvenation. In the United States, we would call that Make China Great Again. The parallels between Xi and Trump are absolutely astonishing. In fact, China is more of a MAGA country than the US would ever be. No immigration, very few public social benefits. We can go down the list of things that they're doing in China, which the MAGA right would absolutely love. But a big part of it is this idea that China was once a great power, but China will never, ever be on its knees again. So there's this grievance-based politics that drives Xi, much like Trump. That the century of humiliation happened, and they nurse it, and they milk it, and it continues to kind of weigh on politics, and this crisis that we have between Japan and China today is firmly anchored in that. If you don't understand the history, you don't understand what's happening there. But this idea of national rejuvenation and the community for common destiny is the architecture for Xi Jinping thought, and that is what all of this is kind of guided in, this very strong nationalist drive for the rejuvenation of the Chinese state. They want to create an alternative to the US-led international system, not a replacement, but it is a parallel international governance architecture. And the idea, what in their mind, is they say that the US is a hegemonic, unipolar power that forces countries to accept its terms or else. Now, Trump certainly is doing that now, certainly. But China says we want to build a cooperative, particularly with global South countries at the core. We want you to be at the table. And they feel that global governance is broken. And they have taken full advantage of the horrors of Gaza, and they have conveniently overlooked the horrors of Ukraine because it doesn't suit them. They have seen the duplicity in the international system when the West and countries like Australia will preach all sorts of things about going green to developing countries, and yet I choke on Australian coal in this winters in Vietnam. Australia remains one of the largest fossil fuels producing countries in the world. And they have highlighted the duplicity and hypocrisy of the rules-based international order that they feel has not treated developing countries and themselves well. So they want to reform global governance. So what does this actually look like in practice? So here are some of the institutions. And this is very important because when a Chinese ambassador gets to a country like Togo, or pick any country, even Vietnam, anyone, and he sits down with the foreign minister, and the foreign minister says, "What do you got? What do you want to do?" The ambassador says, "What do you need? Because I've got a lot of things now that I can help you with. We've got the BRICS, we've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we've got the new development bank, we've got the new SCO development bank, we've got the Belt and Road, we've got now 5 new governance initiatives that all include you at the center of it." The rules-based international order did not include you. And we heard from our ambassadors and our diplomats yesterday, and this is typical, that what the West wants to do is maintain the rules-based international order. And if you're sitting in Vietnam, or if you're sitting in Africa, or if you're sitting in Latin America, that rules-based international order is backwards looking. You want to preserve the system the way it was. And the way it was did not serve global South countries very well. Remember, April of this year was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam. I was alive for that. The Cold War was brutal to the global South. We in the West have largely forgotten these traumas. Most of the people in power today in Vietnam emerged from that. So when we talk about preservation of the rules-based international order as being fair, well then they look to Gaza and they say, "I don't understand. You said that it's fair, but yet you didn't enforce the rules." Same with Russia. You said it was fair, but you didn't enforce the rules. Now in the Caribbean, we're blowing ships out of the sea completely in an extrajudicial way. So what is this rules-based international order, you say? The Chinese pick up on this and they say, "We want to include you." So we've got the new 5 Gs. These are very important. These are very opaque, very vague concepts. Those are features, not bugs. So we've got governance, development, security, civilization, and AI. We'll start with development. This is the most important one for you. The GDI was launched on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in 2022. 70 foreign ministers or deputy ministers were in attendance for this thing in New York. The New York Times didn't even send a reporter. They're not paying attention, they don't care, they're not even seeing it. But when 70 foreign ministers show up for something, that's important. And the GDI, you'll talk to foreign ministers and they'll say, I don't know what it is, but might as well put my name down, can't hurt. But what it is it's tied in with the SDGs, which is why this is very important about the survival of the UN for China's future engagement. It's an inclusive development strategy. This is very important because that's forward-looking again. It's not backwards-looking. We don't quite know what they want to do with it. They haven't actually committed hard cash to it, even though they're now starting to fold in money as saying that this was a GDI initiative. So you know when they do these announcements, they say, we have attached $10 billion to something, and those are deals that they've had on the table for 3 years that they all of a sudden rebrand as GDI. So again, we don't quite know what it is. The language sounds good, so countries are signing up because they go, why not? Global Security Initiative is intended to offset or replace or be an alternative to NATO and the Western and the US-led security system. So we're starting to see a lot of talk about the GSI in Africa and in other, and I think even in the Pacific Islands, they're talking about GSI and some of the security arrangements as well. It is the framework for their security dialogues that they're having. Again, very abstract in what they are. But that abstract, again, is a feature, not a bug, because it allows them to adapt it to whatever the moment needs. So the BRI, too, remember, no secretariat of the BRI. There's no headquarters of the BRI. There's no charter of the BRI. This allows them to reinvent it. It's almost like an amoeba that takes a new shape to accommodate to whatever the geopolitical environments are. All of these are that way. Global Civilization Initiative is also very interesting, and this one's very important for this crowd. This is to redefine the definition of human rights. The Chinese recoil under the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They don't believe in universal values. They believe that human rights, like national sovereignty and digital rights, are all subject to the sovereign decisions of a country, not for a global body. They want to redefine that, and that's in particularly around the idea that the West can say, you are violating human rights to a country in Nigeria, a country like China, a country anywhere that doesn't have the same standards of human rights as the West does. This is the architecture for a new human rights language. And the new AI initiative is the idea of framing rules around next generation technologies where we're really in a competition between the US and China over AI. And so they want to shape those rules. That's somebody that should be well known here. By the way, I highly recommend his book on Xi Jinping. It's thick, it's hard, it's like a PhD dissertation, but understanding who Xi Jinping is absolutely central to understanding politics in the 21st century. He is as transformational a figure as Trump is, yet people know very little about him. Kevin Rudd wrote really a seminal book on it, but it's hard and thick to get through. He says the same thing that I'm saying. China has a vision for the future. Ask the Americans, ask the British, ask the Australians. When you sit down with your partners, what do you tell them about the future? They have nothing. The institutions and the systems that they built are falling apart. They're losing credibility. They don't have a forward-looking vision. They struggle to articulate a forward-looking vision. This is why China is getting traction, because when they sit down, that ambassador sits down, and he's got the 5Gs, he's got the institutions, he's got the gatherings. Every 3 years, there's a FOCAC gathering between China and African countries. More African countries go to FOCAC than go to the UN General Assembly. Okay? This is a forward-looking vision. We don't have to agree that the vision is good or it's even that useful, but it's something. The West doesn't have that vision right now. So will developing countries take all of this seriously? Yeah, ish. They're smart, they're pragmatic. They're gonna sign up. Don't interpret that their participation at FOCAC or their participation at these forums or their signing up to the GDI means that they're buying into everything Chinese. They're not. They're being pragmatic. They're being, you know what? I'll take a chance. At worst, I get a free trip to China. At worst, I ingratiate myself with a P5 Security Council member who might be able to help me if I need some help at the World Health Organization, who might be able to help me if I need some help somewhere else. That's politics. So we are interpreting sometimes, again, in this very binary way. We see country X show up at a GDI conference, we think, oh my God. No, they're being pragmatic. And so they're not buying into all of it. Very important, none of the countries that I study in the Global South want to emulate China. They don't want to be like China. They don't want China's political system. Even Vietnam, which is a Marxist-Leninist, Confucian communist country, wants to differentiate. It's not importing the Chinese methods. They like parts of what China's doing. They like the infrastructure growth. They like the industrialization. They like the fact that Chinese social contracts with their people are strong. There's a lot there that they like, but they're very selective. The 5Gs, as we talked about, lack detail, but it's not clear what they represent. Also, China literacy in most of the Global South remains very poor, so they don't have think tanks and analysts who are breaking down the 5Gs and telling them and giving them policy papers. So they're kind of going on very little knowledge, but again, they're going. And Chinese policymakers, 5 years after, after all of that's BRI, sorry, everything remains unstructured. And again, that is a feature, not a bug. And we have to kind of adapt to this very fluid reality. So let me just quickly wrap up. We're seeing these changes on the humanitarian side. We're seeing the changes in the foreign policy side that are all bolstered by this new governance architecture and this new strong kind of, political drive by Xi. Those two things go together. And I think this is the architecture of what an emerging post-American order looks like. And again, Myanmar was a first peek at it, but I don't think it's going to be the last. So let's stop there, maybe.
Thanks so much, Eric. I didn't say you were going to like what he had to say, but you've got to admit he knows how to say it. We have now got 15 minutes. It was delightful.
Over budget.
Well, you were.
Over budget.
You had lots to say, some very important things to say, some provocative things to say. I'm going to turn straight to the audience to see what questions we've got, and we've got about 15, 20 minutes for that. I think the first hand's gone up at the back. If you're happy to, could you please let Eric know who he's speaking to? If you'd rather remain anonymous, that's also your privilege.
Sure, this is on. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was super interesting. I'm Nicole Meyer. I'm actually the head of cooperation in Myanmar for the Canadian Embassy.
Okay.
So I'm coming from Myanmar. So my question is actually about your example around humanitarian assistance and the earthquake. So I understand what you're saying about how it was a different response, but I think you left out the point on how aid from the West would have been seen as legitimizing the regime, because it's a very different country, right? And so that seems the way of engaging with the military junta. So it's a very specific context as well, that one example around humanitarian assistance. So my question for you is, do you think you would see the same thing if an earthquake like what happened in Mandalay happened in the Philippines or Indonesia? Because I think you might see something different.
The Philippines is a very particular case given the political tensions that are there. If we see a change of government in the Philippines and a Duterte-allied candidate wins the presidency, possibly, okay? Indonesia, yes, I do believe you would see, given the close relationship between Prabowo and the Chinese. I think you would see the same Y-20s coming in, and I think you would see equally robust as what we saw in Myanmar. Certainly Vietnam, probably not. The Vietnamese would be very sensitive to that. So the point that you're making that Myanmar is in some ways unique is an absolutely important point to make. I still struggle with the idea that the regime is bad, so therefore we're going to deprive the people of aid. I just have a problem with that. And I think I think a lot of people have a problem with that. I think the people who were suffering didn't have anything to do with the regime. So I think that's a moral question that a lot of people have about the West, that there has to be a way to get aid in, even in regimes that are objectionable politically to the outside world. But to your point, in the Philippines, money would probably be sent, but not necessarily materiel. So yes, it varies a lot on the country. I think that's a good point.
Jenny Gordon, ANU. Thank you. That was great. Great to kind of make people think about what's going on. But my question is, what do you think is going to happen when these pragmatic developing countries do things that China doesn't like? How much is it going to wield either the soft power of the kind of, well, we'll come and help you if we like you, and we won't come and help you if we won't, and the harder power of, well, you're pretty dependent on us on a supply chain. I suspect militarily that's not going to be the issue, but it's going to be the economic and the sort of that aid. But what's your thoughts on how much they're going to wield that kind of power?
So the good news for almost every developing country, except a few here in the Pacific Islands, is that the things that they would do that would provoke that kind of reaction to China are what I call, okay, here's my acronym to remember, these are the red lines. 4T, HK, XJ, CSCS, okay? These are the lines here. Okay, 4 T's. Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the party. XJ, Xinjiang, HK, Hong Kong. C is COVID. SCS is South China Sea. Now, it gets longer and longer. And by the way, it feels like Australia hit all of those at one point. So Australia is the perfect example. You cross these lines, you get this blowback. Australia, by the way, is also the example for China pushing as much coercion as it could on Australia, and it didn't work. Okay, but a small developing country that doesn't have huge amounts of bauxite and iron ore doesn't have that luxury. The good news for most of these small developing countries is they don't give two craps about Xinjiang, about Hong Kong, about South China Sea, about the party, about Tiananmen Square, all of that. So therefore, they don't come anywhere near the red lines. I said the Pacific Islands is a little bit different because there's a cluster of 3 countries here that still recognize Taiwan. That makes these Pacific Islands a central focus for the Chinese to either constrain those islands, interfere in those islands, or try and persuade them to switch their allegiance, which Palau will never do, Micronesia. So this is not a concern. The Chinese coercion that we're seeing, say, here in Australia is not happening in Botswana, it's not happening in Burundi, because they're not touching on those red line issues. And those are the red line issues that would provoke a Chinese backlash.
Hi, Helen Durham, CEO Red R Australia, and thank you, Eric. I think that it's incredibly important that you give a lecture like this, and that we don't sleepwalk into the idea that we're going back to the same. I wanted to flag the issue around the fear, obviously, of peer-to-peer conflict. We've had the last few decades of obviously a focus on non-international armed conflicts, and now there's a lot of discourse, particularly in the military, that we're looking at big peer-to-peer conflict. Layered onto that, it's interesting, at least in my experience, that whilst on one hand you see a lack of appetite and a rise of the profiling of the hypocrisy of the rules-based order from World War II and sort of rupture to the discourse, you're also seeing, at least in my space, a lot more engagement by China. They're joining things like the Global Initiative on IHL that the ICRC is running. They're putting key figures. I work very closely with the president of the Chinese Red Cross in my global work. So in the last year or so, I've seen them surge into areas, maybe not to replace a power, but to engage. So how do we look at the 2 layers of concern and hypocrisy looking back, but also not wanting to disturb the Security Council power? Like, I don't think China has any desire to unsettle places where it has positions of power. So how do we play that through? And then what do you think about this peer-to-peer discourse? Is it something China is enjoying the murmurs about, or is it something that is coming from a paranoid point of view?
So let's start with the UN agencies, for example, and the globalization. The Chinese are very keen to really be a norm setter. So this is why their placement at the International Telecommunications Union is so important. And their norm setting on technology, their norm setting on AI, their norm setting on all sorts of different ways. Now increasingly we're seeing standard gauge railways being installed all over the world. The railway standards, the railway technologies, the switching methods, all Chinese. So they really do believe in these international institutions. So that's why you're seeing very active engagement in these institutions, because they want to be present in norm setting. They clearly see an opportunity that the United States is pulling out. They're trying to be much more engaged and much more active. Again, to that Chinese scholar that I put in there, they are not trying to replace or overthrow the system. Very, very important. When you hear Sky News talking about that, and some dipshit analyst on Sky News saying that, you have to go, it's just not true. Okay, and to your point, they are participating in the ICRC, they're participating in a lot of these institutions. When they went to the Obama administration and said, we believe that the IMF charter is very clear in saying that shares are allocated based on the size of the economy, so we should have the second largest shares. The Obama administration said, no. So then they went and started their own institution in the form of the AIIB. The AIIB performs at international standards. Australia's a member, the UK's a member. So this is not them trying to withdraw at all in the system. They do want to shape the system to their norms, to their values, and to their politics. In many ways, we find that very foreign, strange, and fearful. On the peer-to-peer conflict part, on the one hand, I think China, and it sells you look at Chinese media, nationalist media, they love this idea that if a war was to break out in the South China Sea, pretty much all of the war games scenarios show that the Chinese would emerge victorious. They also don't like this because they're not 100% confident that they're ready for this. And they also know that if war breaks out, that will send them into a period of economic darkness for potentially 20 years. So on the one hand, there's this sense of like, we finally made it. On the other hand, it's like, oh, yeah, we need to hold. And you see these contradictions on the one hand, and you see this play out. Are they a developing country or a non-developing country? According to the World Trade Organization, now they pulled back, and they're not a developing country. But in Brazil, at COP30, they said, no, we're very much a developing country. They didn't want to take the leadership at COP30 when everybody wanted to put them up on the pedestal. So this type of schizophrenia is very common right now in where we are, whether they are a peer with the US or not, whether they are a leader, whether or not, whether they're an industrial economy or a poor economy. There's a lot of that schizophrenia around. Again, this is what makes China so complicated to understand.
If I may start, my name is Zahid Iqbal, and I represent a company, Australian engineering and development company called SMEC. And we predominantly work into the Southeast Asia, Asia, and Africa, a lot of areas. So I liked one of your statements, which is Asia for the Asian. So that's happening.
Well, that's their statement, not mine.
You have presented it. Thank you so much. And while we are working in the region, and we can see that countries like Malaysia is already come out of the middle-income country. Indonesia is middle-income country, and Philippines will be middle-income country in a few years. So all these powers are actually the Asian country. They're gathering wealth and everything. So in the years to come, there will be a global shift and the vacuum which has been created by the USAID pulling out. So where do we, as an Australian aid agency, Australia, where do we fit into that bigger game into the next maybe a decade or so, if you can give
This is hard for Australia, and it's hard for middle power countries because you're too small to move the needle on anything, okay, but you're still big enough to have impact and to be relevant. So the story for me is, number one, you got to come up with this vision thing. This is really important. What do you stand for, other than preserving the system the way it was? This is a problem for Canada as well. It's a problem for Europe as well. This is one of the reasons why Europe, it's just remarkable for a continent that has shaped the lives of so many people for 5 centuries now, is just completely weak and insignificant. But part of it is the lack of this vision thing. So number one, maybe new institutions need to form along the lines of Britain, Australia, Canada, these are these middle power countries, to form a coalition to build ideas like what the Chinese have built, which is development, coalitions, and a vision. What do you stand for? I mean, I know what you stand for, which is for a company, you say, I want to generate revenue. But what does the country stand for? We don't have that right now in the West. And I think that's the first thing. The Chinese, when that ambassador sits down, has got a lot of things to talk about that are forward-looking. I challenge the West does not have a lot of forward-looking things. So I think first and foremost, what do? You start with the vision thing. The next thing, you start building coalitions that are like-minded. And by the way, the United States today, and I don't know if somebody's from the US Embassy here or not, is going to report me back and I can't go home again. The United States is becoming a belligerent power. It just is. It's in many ways, I see the US almost becoming like Russia, where it's just messing stuff up because it can. It's doing it for the lulz. There's no rhyme or reason or strategy other than what Donald Trump is doing, okay? So I'm not entirely sure that the US is the anchor of your strategy. Now the US may be parts of it because civil society is still very strong in the US and we can't write off the US for everything, but at least on a government-to-government basis, I'm not sure the US is aligned with what you want to do. Certainly the Canadians don't believe that. Mark Carney has been very clear that the relationship with the US is fundamentally over as we know it. And so, first and foremost, I say the vision thing. That's the most important thing, and the Chinese have done that.
And that's the last question at the back.
It's Mark Moran. I'm affiliated with the Dev Policy Centre here at ANU. Look, I just want to take what you just said further a little bit. I mean, among those coalition of other countries, with Australia, I mean, Australia, we have most recently it's all been competition, but, you know, we have a strong history in China. I think we were the first Australian embassy from the West. We had a very strong aid program for a very long time. So, you know, do you have a view on what can Australia do as a middle-income country and as a leader in this vision?
Yeah. So former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had this model, which I think worked really well. Compete, cooperate, contest. Okay, so Australia is never going to be an ally country of China. But there are areas of cooperation, particularly in aid and development. Now, the Australians will say, we tried to work with the Chinese in the Pacific Islands, and it didn't work. And I kind of came back at them and said, well, the Pacific Islands is a contested space. This is not a space where you're going to have a lot of trust between the Chinese and the Australians, because both of you want to exert influence. Let's go back to Togo as my example. Find a neutral country where the aid teams can work together, a little bit like what we're talking about with the ICRC. Just get the modalities of communication, get the understandings of how to communicate, to talk, to engage, just so that from a partner-to-partner basis, relationships form. Start in a neutral place that's not contested. This is one of the things, and this might offend some of the sensibilities of people in this room. When I told the British this, they kind of... the French are actually doing this quite well. The French provide a very interesting model here. They've signed, back in 2022, $1.7 billion for 5 infrastructure deals in the Global South for aid development. But at the same time, the French are very, very clear on contesting China on human rights, on unfair trade practices. They are able to compartmentalize their relationship in such a way. And Macron was just in Beijing this week, and every time he goes to China, it looks like he's about to kiss Xi Jinping. They're so in love. And so you see the cooperate, compete, and contest play out. What fills each of those buckets? And having a very clear vision of what fills each of those buckets. I know the folks here at DFAT are very clear on the competition part. They're not as clear, and they're clear on the contestation part in the South China Sea and other areas. They're not as clear on the cooperation part. And I think that is an area, and even with Australia's limited aid budgets, there are opportunities to do things, but find non or uncontested spaces to do those in, to build up the relationships. But it's just the final point. It's the same reason why militaries do these ship-to-ship transfer trainings of a helicopter landing on one ship and then landing on another ship. So they know how to communicate with each other, they know how the equipment interoperates. We have to do the same thing in aid. I think the Chinese would be willing to learn from you as well. And that's why I think it would work in Togo, but not the Pacific Islands.
Well, thanks very much on that note. I think they're saying it all, Eric. Thanks so much. And if you haven't found him already, just go onto any podcast platform or Google him. You can listen to him for hours on end talking on a whole range of podcasts. And let's all practice that acronym. I want to hear you say it backwards. Thanks all. Morning tea's now served.